Good afternoon to those in Asia. Good evening and good night to those in the Pacific. Good morning to those in Europe, in the UK and Europe. Our friends in the Americas who registered are really at an impossible time. It's around 3 a.m. there. So they have asked to be sent the recording, which we will do. This is the third of a series of webinars, and the last of a series of webinars supported by the Asia Development Bank and financed by the Japan Fund for Poverty Reduction and the Republic of Korea East Asia Knowledge Partnership Fund. The first two webinars were one on inequalities and old age, and the second one on climate change and older people. The topic today is related to exploring what building back better means for current and future older people, and what needs to happen in order to make better really mean better and not be just an empty statement. This session is designed as a conversation and not as a set of presentation after presentation. A conversation means discussion, means agreements, means disagreements. This naturally requires skillful moderation, which will be handled by John Beard. We have a great lineup of experts today coming from different spheres of life. Let me start with Marianne Tsao. Marianne is the chairperson and founding director of the Tsao Foundation, which is a Singapore-based but regionally oriented non-profit foundation dedicated to aged care and aging issues. Punki Sumadi is Deputy Minister for Population and Employment of the Ministry of National Development Planning, Bappenas of Indonesia. And mind you, Indonesia is a country with 230 million inhabitants. 25 million or so are older age. He is responsible for planning, policy coordination, and promoting development issues of population, labor, poverty reduction, social protection, and in general, social issues. Ms. Aiko Kikawa-Takenaka, she is an economist of the Asia Development Bank Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. Her research portfolio covers aging and demographic changes, which is perfect for this discussion. She is also the lead author of one chapter in the ADB's Asia Economic Integration Report for 2019-2020, which has the theme of demographic change, productivity, and the role of technology, also very relevant for this discussion. Professor Sarah Harper is a Clore Professor of Gerontology at the University of Oxford. Most of you know her or of her. She is a fellow at University College and the founding director of the Oxford Institute for Population Aging. And last but not least, Stephen Kidd. He is a founder and principal social policy specialist of Development Pathways. He has over 3 decades supported, advocated, and fought for robust strategies and effective delivery in social development and social protection in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, and in Latin America. I think he was for some years in Paraguay, if I'm correct. Let me now, I'll introduce John Beard later, but let me now introduce Stuart Gittel-Basten from the Hong Kong University, who will make an introduction to the theme. I always mispronounce his name. Is Stuart Gittel, but he will say it correctly in the video that we'll see now. Stuart.
Greetings from Hong Kong. My name is Stuart Gittel-Basten, and I'm the director of our Centre for Aging Science here at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm honoured to have been asked by HelpAge International's Asia Pacific office to prepare a short video on the topic of building back better after COVID-19 and how this links to ageing in the Asia Pacific region. Now, the relationship between older age and the prevalence of some underlying health conditions has meant that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected older persons in the region. Yet the effects of the pandemic go beyond health. As a recent HelpAge International report highlights, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, ageism, discrimination, abuse and violence, and has disrupted income security. Now, while the story of older persons and COVID-19 in Asia Pacific is not yet complete, HelpAge International have begun to explore some ways in which we can learn from the experiences of the pandemic to build back better for older persons. Now, the idea of building back better was originally applied to improving the resilience of physical infrastructure which may have been rebuilt following natural disasters. Now, the metaphor has been expanded to building back social and economic infrastructure, even meta-institutional systems such as capitalism itself. Now, in order to build back better, therefore, it's imperative to see what worked in terms of supporting older persons and enabling them to support themselves and their communities throughout the pandemic. Now, where they exist, robust and fit-for-purpose social and economic support systems have largely demonstrated their worth in serving older persons and the community throughout the recent crisis. Let's consider the Thai experience, for example, which has been broadly hailed as a case study in successful response among middle-income countries. As well as universal healthcare and broader integrated health policies, the expansion of social protection provided further resilience for older persons. Community solidarity and engagement also played a critical role in shaping the successful experience. Now, we may have seen what works, or at least some version of it, and to a degree, it probably should not come as a surprise. Social and economic support systems and universal comprehensive health policies have been shown to support people in their social, economic, and physical well-being. Now, perhaps though, if we know what works, and indeed if this experience has given us further confidence in the general prescription for a better lived experience for older persons, the crucial question is, how do we get there? Of course, the simplest solution is just to spend. Stimulus spending in developing robust social institutions is very tempting. However, the context of a possible long-run economic downturn, the challenges of recovery in certain sectors such as tourism, governance issues, informality in the labour market, institutional infrastructure in some parts of the region clearly represent key challenges to this simple approach. In a sense, then, we can ask whether the experiences pandemic has offered us any other insights into this question of building back better, either at an empirical or conceptual level. So what are the other green shoots of pathways to change that are appearing which can be built on? Now, for example, it has often been suggested that the institutional structures of government may not be amenable for dealing with holistic, cross-cutting issues such as ageing. Yet many governments have shown that it is indeed possible, when the need arises, to collaborate across line ministries with local governments, community and local workers on strategy and implementation. Renewed attention has also been placed on the need for an integrated health and social care approach, as well as the key role for social workers and community support. Furthermore, the exposure of the digital divide in terms of accessing health information and services has led in some countries to very innovative responses, such as the use of interactive TV in China for the delivery of some social work services. Now, perhaps nurturing some of these green shoots of change may represent a pathway to bringing about some of these structural transformations in health, social and economic systems which better support older persons. Appraising such a possibility will require a fuller understanding of both the relevant actors and the pressures which will be placed upon them. Now, when we look back in history, we can see the various pressures which have motivated either top-down change from technocrats and politicians or bottom-up developments from public movements. These may be from political crises, demographic change, fiscal fears, public enlightenment, and so on. So we'll need to explore the extent to which the experience of pandemic has led to any changes in the nature of these underlying pressures. But lastly, maybe we can think more radically still, whether or not a paradigm shift could occur. We may have goals around the protection of health services, social protection, the protection of jobs, vulnerable workers in the informal economy, the development of social cohesion, and so on. But perhaps there are alternative models and frameworks which can be considered in terms of how to get there. So as we look for diversification in the economy after the current disruption to standard flows of goods and people, maybe this is the time for the care economy to come into its own. In many territories, community mobilization has been instrumental in developing strong responses. Again, perhaps this might open up new possibilities of decentralizing decision-making and provision of public services. In this sense, we may ask, are we really aspiring to build back better? Or, in fact, could the experience of pandemic be an opportunity for us to stop, take stock, and take on an entirely different pathway altogether? I hope that this and other issues may be explored in this important webinar on building back better or otherwise for older persons in Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Stuart. I think very thought-provoking intervention. May I now introduce John Beard, who will moderate the rest of this session. John is the former director of the Department of Aging and Life course in the World Health Organization and linked to different academic institutions now. During his tenure, almost 10 years in the WHO, at least as head of the Department of Aging and Life course, John was one of the key authors of this seminal report called Aging and Health, which I recommend to all of you. It's brilliant, the scope of this intersection between health and aging and population aging. But we are going back to the theme, and John will lead us with the skills that he usually possesses. I hope today you possess that one through this conversation. Please, John, go ahead.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thanks for the free advertorial too. Look, I'm really looking forward to this session. You heard from Stuart the sorts of issues which we're going to be exploring, and we have, as you've already been introduced to, a fantastic panel. We're going to try and keep it informal, and we're going to try and have some discussions. I've asked our speakers to be pithy in their responses, and we're going to try and be entertaining. I also think if we need to disagree. And that's sometimes where we find the real innovations which lead to future success. So I'm going to encourage dissent as well. And there will also be the opportunity for you to engage through the question and answer box on Zoom. So please engage. So I'd like to start by trying to get concrete, because it's very easy when you have these slogans, build back better, to talk in motherhood statements. But I'd actually like to start by asking each of our panelists just to give us one concrete transformational change you might think of that's either demonstrating or might demonstrate how we could build back better in the future, with just a very quick response. So Sarah, I'll start with you. Do you have a concrete transformational change which could help us build back better?
Well, I think one thing that very clearly came out of Stuart's excellent overview was that older adults have really been disproportionately affected. And one of the responses to the very high death rates among older adults was to shut them away. And I think that was a very pragmatic policy. We now have had a bit of pushback saying we must be very careful that locking older adults away at a time of emergency doesn't lead into some kind of institutional ageism. And I think it's very clear that we have a wonderful opportunity now. As you're aware, the UN is about to publish its report on ageism. And I think this is a really good opportunity to be able to stand back. Families and young people have become far more involved in older adults, and maybe this is the time to rebuild within a non-ageist frame, and maybe even talk about a human rights convention. But this is how we should be framing Build Back Better.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephen, I'll ask you next for your one concrete transformation.
Well, it's a transformation that should have happened a long time before the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, it is scandalous that in this modern age, so many older people do not have decent old age pensions. I mean, if you don't have income security in old age, then you're really going to struggle, because we can't expect people to continue to work when they become increasingly frail, or we can't expect families to keep on looking after you, particularly when we have widespread low incomes across the region where families are struggling to look after their kids. So decent old age pensions needs to be put in place. But what we have is many countries without, where the vast majority are without. We also have a range of countries, larger countries like China and Thailand, where actually the existing pension system, the values of the pensions are too small. The basic minimum pension, they need to be increased. But this is the thing, give older people income security, and then you'll allow older people to blossom throughout their last years.
Excellent, thank you. Punky, do
yes.
you have?
Yes, John. In Indonesian government have been doing lots of reforms, especially since the pandemic started last year. Actually, I'm involved in the reform of the healthcare and the social protection systems. But one thing that I would like to see transforming is that actually expand the elderly caregiving system at the community level. Because we have done some studies since last year. Actually, what we have found is that, for example, at the economic aspect, 50% of the elderly that we surveyed lost their income. 16% of the respondents actually they have deteriorating health condition, and then the support system that they have received is actually quite enormous, even though they are restricted to the ability to get in touch or get contact with the neighbors, family members, things like that. But again, actually, there are strong indications of community activities to reach out to them, give them supports, give them whatever helps that they need. This is actually what inspires us. Actually, hey, we don't do enough on this element. We maybe have lots of experience in, for example, other developments, but for giving care to the elderly, we don't do enough. This is actually one of the main issue I would like to expand further.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to come back to that. Aiko, do you have one transformation?
Sure. I think everyone agrees that we have seen sort of a fast tracking of technology and innovation really bloom during the COVID, and that the frontiers that can be filled are so rich. In a report that was mentioned by Eduardo, we looked at then what kind of technology could be really leveraged to support and empower older persons. And there are so many range stemming from how to help older person be productive in terms of their physical to cognitive abilities. There are so many wide array of ways for an older person to learn, and also to facilitate lifelong learning. So it's not just about older person, but the future cohort of older person would have more opportunity to be prepared. We've seen sort of a development of more technology to match workers to employment. And this is particularly useful for older person because they have specific job requirement or the talent that can be matched, but could be a little bit more niche. And of course, we've seen the extension. This is the biggest in the healthcare areas, telemedicines to wearables to track your health. I think those have really expanded. Now in Japan, it's very popular to try this pulse oximeter to check how healthy you are in terms of your blood. So those things have expanded, and to make this technology available to all the person, we could work better to bring more digital literacies, bring this digital divide, the gray divide. And with that, we could really harness this technology for adapt better to aging. Thank you.
Terrific, and I'd like to come back to some of those points too. Marianne, your one example.
Yeah, I'm a practitioner, so I really saw what's actually happening to the older people in the community. So I want to build on what Aiko was saying. Is that one of the big issue was a digital divide, because most of our older people were not so well educated and they did not know how to use online anything. And during the isolation period, they got that much more isolated because they can't connect to other people. And as a matter of fact, building back, so to speak, building forward is that being able to get them online, which is not without its issues, because it's not so easy to teach them to get online because the devices are not produced for older people. They're too complicated and they're too small. As a matter of fact, people say you can't teach older people to use these things, which my point is that the products are not the right one for older people to get on. So you have to look at older people are very different, very heterogeneous. Some of them very savvy, but many of the older ones are not. And they're the ones who are likely to live alone and be isolated. So to teach them to get online is a bit of a struggle, but could be done. And once you can get it done, address a second major issue, which is a loss of function, both mentally, cognitive, emotional, as well, socially, as well as physical. So being able to connect them, even during peacetime, so to speak, they would be able to create social groups, be able to get WhatsApp thing going on. They can do telemedicine. They can sing and dance together, for us, you know. So I think being connected is really key. But we're talking about some fundamentals. Be able to access the equipment they can use and affordable plans, things like that, which I must say the Singapore government's done a pretty good job in getting that together and getting people to teach them how to use it, give them affordable, subsidized data plans and that sort of thing. But once you get online, there's all the things like Kiko say, but even very fundamentally, it's connecting them to friends and family, connecting them to peers that can exercise and do social activities together, get them functionally active because they can exercise together. It's actually really just the most basic, just WhatsApp and Zoom, that alone can do a lot, not to speak of other things. So that is definitely one of the major, I think, transformation for us in parts of the area that see a lot of lower income older persons who had not been online before.
Great. So you're agreeing, but you're also flagging this issue of the digital divide and how we can ensure that if we do have technological advances like Aiko was describing, that we need to make sure that those are applicable to poor people, people with literacy issues, people with functional issues. Right. It actually reminds me of the story of the Raku phone. Aiko, I don't know if you know this, but there was a phone that was designed in Japan for older people because they said these same issues that you're raising, Marianne, and it was they designed this big phone with big buttons and it was really simple and it bombed. It was, but it did have some really neat twists to it. For example, I think there was a button you could press which slowed down the person talking to you. So you know, if you had a bit of trouble understanding it, it would help with that. Sometimes I prefer the other button that speeds people up. But anyway, what happened though was the developers went back to the drawing board and they understand that they'd built this on a stereotype of older people. And then they reinvented it as the Raku phone, which ended up being the #1 selling phone in the United States and Japan. Because it was actually functional for everybody. It wasn't labeled as something for older people, but they thought about these sorts of issues you're talking about in terms of function, and that made it a better tool for everybody. So, okay, thank you for all those initial ideas. We also asked some other leaders who weren't able to join us today, but we asked them for some video contributions to suggest if they had some transformations which they thought might fit in. And Eduardo and team, I'm wondering if we can show that video now.
What would building back better mean for older persons? I do think the COVID pandemic has revealed enormous inequalities between people, including people of different ages, and enormous weaknesses in institutions, including care facilities for older persons.
The unexpected COVID-19 pandemic showed that even advanced societies with established care systems for older people were unable to cope efficiently with the health and other aspects of their aged population.
On what would building back better mean for older people or aging population? I think we should not be looking at building back better, but focus on building forward better.
I suppose first and foremost is improved healthcare systems. And I think it's critical that these address not just national problems, but we now see how important it is that they address global health problems as well.
Building back better means change for the older populations, especially the improvement on social policies and health services for the elderly, especially mainstreaming the aging into the social policies.
And also at the UN declared on 14th of December the decade of healthy aging, 2021 to 2030. And this is a huge, development and huge achievement for older people.
The second element to building back better is to have economies that provide opportunity and security for older persons.
Recognizing the immense contribution to socio-economic development of the countries and supporting them to have a dignified old age.
Older people, their number is increasing, and they are able to, support government and the economy if they have opportunity.
To make sure that we have governments that are financially strong and are responsive to the needs of older persons.
I do think what we are seeing is to some extent the result of a worldview that sees population aging and older persons as a cost primarily to society, and that has encouraged all kinds of cost savings.
And in particular, I think there's been a growing acknowledgement that the voice of older adults really has to be listened to when it comes to policy making. Because it's absolutely fine to have pragmatic policy in the middle of a pandemic. We just have to make sure that this doesn't become institutionalized ageism.
And I do think we have to fundamentally change this worldview and look at population aging and older persons also as an opportunity.
Building back better for the aging population post-COVID-19 means that there needs to be societal change in many aspects, including at personal, family, community, and national levels.
Strong families provide the most immediate and appropriate responses to health and economic crises.
When we think of how we can build back better, I think one thing that is very clear is that this pandemic has highlighted the isolation and the loneliness of so many older people across the world. And I think this is a real opportunity to look at building truly integrated, intergenerational communities.
Such innovations as e-learning, the influence of social media, and new technologies have changed our lifestyle and the way of thinking for efficient and inexpensive communications.
When we talk about the internet using or the telemedicine, or even for the daily life for older people, for their social participation, for digital divide, all of these aspects, we need to talk about mainstreaming of the policies, whether the older people can benefit from this kind of improvements or changes.
What signs do you see of building back better? The whole world and all the governments, they have promised to protect old people. This is something new. They never earlier have promised to protect older people.
Many people ask me, are there signs that the world is getting better? Is India getting better for the elderly? But at this time, what I can see is we are still on the edge of the pandemic.
While the pandemic is a tragedy, it is also an opportunity to review our priorities. It is also an opportunity to test our systems and capacities.
The trend is already visible. You can forecast with cautious optimism that the government, which has shown positive attitude towards the older persons, will continue to be supportive for the rights and privileges of older persons, even in the post-corona era.
Only thing we see signs are that the government is now keen on building the health infrastructure for the elderly in many districts. So both healthcare as well as long-term care will improve in the coming years due to the COVID pandemic.
It's really about translating all this good intention that we see into action.
So we have already seen some better developments or change after the post-pandemic period. And then we think that momentum will continue to change the society.
Surely, the negative and positive changes during the COVID-19 pandemic created a momentum for change. But this opportunity needs to be seized for a better future as our society transitions to an aging population.
Now our government, all the governments, they really have realized the aging of the population.
If we don't manage to achieve results now in the near future, I am less optimistic that in the medium term we'll really make all the necessary changes.
But hope that they will remember their promises and their attitudes later on.
What a great video. Thanks, Eduardo and team. Now, Sarah, I see you double dip there, so I'm going to start at the other end of my list, and I'm going to ask Marianne. Marianne, are there any green shoots out there? Are there some things which are starting to happen, which could, where we could see action on building back better, or are there some things in place which we could build on, which might help us move forward?
Right. I think I've talked about the issue about digital divide, and that was so obviously a problem that I think there are definitely movements towards it. But one thing that really popped up was mental health. I think we've all around the world, we recognize that social isolation was a major issue anyway, but I think government's been sweeping them underground, under the rug until this time where social isolation became such a huge issue in terms of depression, anxiety, and a bit of bump up with elderly suicide. So it became an issue cannot avoid. And this is a good thing for Asia because people tend to be not so comfortable talking about emotional issues. And there's a bit of a stigma around, anything mental. I'm not even talking about schizophrenia, something like just anxiety, depression. Depression is such a huge issue for older people. In Singapore, almost 50% of older people over 65 are social isolated. That was before COVID. So COVID just opened that lid and opened that Pandora's box, which is not a bad thing. It's a big issue, but I think there's now at least the Singapore government shining a really bright light on what to do about this issue. Once it gets on the policy agenda, I think there's movement forward, right? And we, of course, on the ground have to do what we can to make sure it stays on the policy agenda, start looking for viable ways of figuring out what are issues around mental health and what are the areas we need more data and what are areas we can actually start to have intervention. So this is one big thing I think is very positive for Singapore. And I would say, in a way, Singapore being very typically Asian, I might share the similar kind of a characteristic with some other Asian countries in terms of not recognizing or not wanting to recognize mental health issues amongst older people. So that's a good thing.
Okay, so we've got this prerequisite that it's now on the policy agenda, which is great. Are we actually seeing any movement? Any of the panelists have ideas? Or I will switch to ACO and say that Marianne mentioned data. And I know ADB is also interested in reporting on actually what's happening. I'm wondering if you've got any comments on how we can better inform governments of the situation and where the gaps are and how we might need to move forward.
Right. So with this COVID, as the situation unfolds, a lot of government have introduced much bigger social protections through either employment subsidies or child benefit and all kinds of expansion of a pension scheme or old age support. And what they find is that it meets certain success. I think the effort was there and that it has reached important population. What is also revealed is that they are indeed good amount for some country, pockets of vulnerable population who were not reached. Informal worker is there, those who used to have income but have lost they're not on the roster to receive those supports. So to better address this, I think government would be more keen to collect more comprehensive data about the population of the older person, so they won't miss out. They don't have any, people that are drained from the system. So as an ADB, we have seen surge of support for financing for different fiscal stimulus to all the others, but also on social protection. And we do see that countries are interested genuinely to improve data collection and to increase the coverage. So definitely data would play an important role, especially to reach those last mile, people that have not reached, and people, government realize that. So yeah, the role of data would be more critical as we reach the last, more difficult people to reach.
Excellent. Any other green shoots that people are seeing, or things we can build on? A couple of you, I think, Punki, you mentioned the need for rethinking social care, and also there's this issue of bringing generations together. One of the fantastic help age initiatives I've always been a great believer in is the intergenerational self-help groups which have been established.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm just wondering what models there are for moving forward on social care in within the Asia Pacific, and are there innovative ways which the Asia Pacific can build back that perhaps the rest of the world can learn from? What did you have in mind when you were raising that, Punki?
Yeah, I try to look around the countries around Indonesia, and then, for example, I read from a report that actually Vietnam is working on the intergenerational self-help groups. I think HelpAge is also involved in there. Malaysia is trying to do the same thing. Some more advanced countries have tried to use the governmental structures or more modern institutions to reach out the elderly there. But what I find similarity between Vietnam and Indonesia is that actually it seems that we have quite of thickness in the social capital, and that enables us the community interaction with the elderly, ranging from simple chit chat, informing about the COVID, the danger of the COVID, health protocols, distribution of government's recovery programs or whatever economic recovery programs, and up to the keeping the house and surroundings clean. So this is actually the kind of interactions that we have seen from our studies during the pandemic system. The second thing is that actually the community members also share their resources to the elderly, not only vitamins, food stuff, but also their money to the elderly in the neighborhood. So actually, this is actually what we think Indonesia should be able to use this kind of advantage, because we have large community development programs that we started in 1998 during the Asia financial crisis. And now we have 84,000 villages, and in each village we have community groups that really work on basic development issues, for example, local infrastructure, health system, and things like that. We just need to introduce actually how they understand basic, simple caregiving practices for the elderly. This is actually what I see the opportunity that we can promote further.
Okay, so basic caregiving practices. I wonder also whether it requires some shift in the way that we view older people themselves. And Sarah, you raised the issue of ageism at the beginning. I'm wondering if there's something we need to do, or if you're aware of that's already happening, where we can shift the perspective of the role of older people and the goal that that these services might be able to provide.
Because I really wanted to come in on what basically linked what Punki had said to that debate we just had a few minutes ago about digital technology, because at Oxford we did quite a lot of work with HelpAge International on older persons associations, and I think it was very, very clear that there is this amazing grassroots of older adults who are working together, and we can really build on that. And the important thing is to move forward and say, how can we build on it also using digital technology? That we're all linked, we're all communicating. We have got fantastic intergenerational communication, I think, over the last year, which has come through older people really engaging digitally, and actually, the potential for them being able to increase their healthcare, etc., in that way. But if we can really support the grassroots that we have across the region, and bring in the digital technology at that level, I think there is a real opportunity to be able to practically move forward.
Okay, so looking at digital technology to support the sort of community development initiative that Punky was talking about. Stephen, you said income security was crucial. Do you see it as becoming more widespread within the Asia Pacific? What are there green shoots, or is it a lost cause?
Well, let me go back. I think there's something.
I'm trying to generate some dissent or some, entertainment.
Yeah, well, I think there's something that Punky said, where he said, in the community, people are sharing the money with older people. I mean, it's great. We get solidarity at the local level, right? That's what people want. But the role of the modern nation state is to bring that solidarity to national level, whereas every citizen is beginning to share and show solidarity through our taxes, so that we can then begin to put in place universal public services, good quality health systems, good quality social care systems, good quality social security pension systems for everybody. That's what we need to be delivering. Now, is there a sign of that happening? I think there's a real danger. On the positive side, I think, it's recognized that social protection now is the fact that we're weak systems meant that governments couldn't respond, and now there's a much bigger role for social protection. The problems are the other side. Everybody that I talk to, government is beginning to say, well, we got no fiscal space now because our economies have crashed. We've got no fiscal space, so we can't do this. But that's a self-defeating argument. If you don't invest, if you don't have the fiscal stimulus, if you don't put in place, don't deliver cash into the hands of people, you're not going to generate your economic recovery. That's a major opportunity for old age pensions and other social protection systems, and on a universal basis, is to put that cash into the hands of older people and others, get them spending, help economic recovery, and there'll be many, many other positive spin-offs, so that in the communities that Punk is talking about, we'll find a very different situation. We find in countries which have a good old age pensions, where it's older people who are sharing their cash to help others, to help children, and reversing this solidarity and using their wisdom to look after the community, rather than being put into this very dependent state as we have at the moment.
I think this is a really critical issue, this stereotype which economists in particular seem to portray of older people being dependent and a burden on society, and that expenditure on older people is a drain. And it was interesting, when I was at WHO, we pulled together some senior economists from around the world to try and get them to think about it more as a balance between costs and contributions, because what happens is the economists measure the costs and they see it as just a bottomless hole, and governments say, no, we've got to pay back the pandemic, we can't spend there. But and I think Aiko, it was you that raised this issue, that the older people actually contribute in multiple ways, and we never measure them. And they contribute in terms of they pay taxes, whether it's direct or indirect. They contribute in terms of care they provide. The biggest carers in society are often older people, and they contribute in all sorts of other ways that they can support the integration of communities and the holding together and growth of communities. So I think one of the things for me which resonates with what you're saying, Stephen, is that perhaps we should be, and perhaps Aiko, when the ADB is reporting on the state of older people, we should be looking at both the costs as well as the contributions. And I'm wondering, Punky, would that help be helpful for governments in terms of, would you be more likely to respond positively to Stephen's ideas if it was framed in that way?
That's right. Actually, that is the other things that we have been reforming. Healthcare system. We found out actually our health system is really weak in responding to the pandemic, especially for the elderly. 15 years ago, we had no accessibility for the geriatric services. Now, actually, it is available in the big cities in Indonesia, but we have not reached the secondary and tertiary cities. That's one thing. The second thing, how to finance that. Yes, I agree with Stephen about the funding system. We are reforming our pension programs. We know that actually it is only 9% of Indonesian population who have pension programs there. It is not enough at all. So we are now trying to provide some kind of co-funding for the paying the premium for the workers there. So that will create a step by step in making them understand, okay, now I would like to have government supports me in paying the premium, and then see what the pension programs will become greater and greater in the future.
That's great, Punky. I'm wondering what happens though for self-employed people or farmers or people who don't have an employer. What's the future for them in terms of financial security?
That's actually the real problem, because they don't see actually Social Security as a kind of investment. They think it is only kind of their cost. So we have to work on that harder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sarah, you skipped my question on the role of ageism and how we can move to start changing the way people view older people and many of these issues we're talking about now. I'm wondering if you had anything to add, or if anybody else actually has some more green shoots they want to bring into the conversation. Marianne, or Sarah first, and then Marianne.
Well, I mean, the problem with any kind of discrimination is that it has to come in at various levels. And that's why it's really important that it is at the sort of international and national level we start raising it, and then working with the communities. Can I actually ask Stephen a question based on something that he said? And I think it's very interesting your comment about the importance of sort of public and national provision. Given that we have such intergenerational and community awareness at the moment, how can we ensure that as we build forward welfare and public provision, we keep the informal sector completely involved? So, in other words, we are not only, as remember Stuart said, we're not only building downwards, we're also building upwards and involving older people, families and communities, and ensuring that they also are supported in a sort of public welfare going forward.
Yeah, I'm not saying I fully understand the point. I think what the state has a key role, and I think it's again with Punky said, we say government is supporting. Actually, we've got to remember, government only takes our taxes and redistributes our taxes. Nothing ever comes from government; it's from citizens to citizens, right? We need to remember that. We need to change our way of talking. It's about redistributing our cash to ourselves, often in a cross-generational manner. Okay, so again, it's not about older people paying taxes now. It's about older people who throughout their working lives paid their taxes, and you get support in old age because of what you've done throughout your working life. It's a kind of a basic sort of pay-as-you-go system. That's how we should see, government's role in redistributing our tax. But I think how we involve communities is that communities are it's very difficult to be involved in your community if you don't have adequate income. If we can give people adequate income, give them enough, then they're able to do much more for themselves. They're able to build that as a platform for reaching out and engaging with others. And you can have, and I think somebody said about the carers, older people have the biggest, they're the biggest carers. Across Europe, they're the biggest child care, they're the carers of children for parents who are sending the kids to school. But how can older people do that in Europe? It's because they have old age pensions. If they didn't have old age pensions, you wouldn't get that care support. That would undermine families. And older people would be out scrabbling around in a very weak labor market, but we put that in place. And when did we begin to put this in place? Is because we had a crisis of the Second World War, and we built back better after the Second World War by completely changing the paradigm of social policy from these targeted mean programs prior to the Second World War to building a commitment to universal public services and higher taxation that everybody was willing to pay because we got much better quality services. And I think we need to think about this for other countries and learn the lessons of history as well.
I think that's a great example, the World War example, Stephen. Marianne, I'll let you have one more comment, and then we've got another video to show.
Okay, I was just going to build on what Sarah said about ground up as well as ageism. One thing we learned that actually the care providers, professionals tend to have a bit of ageist view that older people have to be protected. They're not capable of learning so well. But during COVID, we have to teach them, the people with dementia, the caregivers with dementia, we have to train them to be able to do a lot more. And because they can do a lot more, actually they're even better during quote unquote peace times because they can just provide care better. And on top of it, actually being able to connect people like that also help them to help each other. The whole community upset because community members are now, let's say, caregivers of some older person with dementia or frailty, now can help neighbors better because they're actually better trained. So this is something we learned. It's not so much ground up just finance, but it's capability. The older people are capable of learning, but we didn't give it to them until we had no choice but to teach them and realize they're perfectly capable of learning self-care a lot better, and a lot better helps other people in the community as well.
Terrific. And that, to draw on our wartime analogy, that's what happened in the United States, isn't it? When women went into the workforce during the Second World War, and then they stayed there because people realized how vital their contribution could be. Okay, so we're not the only people talking about these sorts of issues. The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, had recently had a meeting of experts to discuss it. They called it Building Forward Better. So we have a video to summarize what they found.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Amal Abu Rafa, and I lead the team that works on aging issues at the UN headquarters in New York. Last week, my team and I held an expert group meeting on the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic as regards older persons and what kind of policy implications those might have. These will feed into the upcoming Secretary General's report that will be addressed to the General Assembly at its 76th session later this fall. Now, Eduardo and Peter had invited me to join you today to share my impressions from what had happened last week during our expert meeting. I would like to share some impressions prior to the meeting, some during the meeting, and some following the meeting. Prior to the meeting, the title itself was quite telling. At first, we started off with the common saying, which is building back better, until someone told us, is that what you really want? Do you want the governments over the next few years to work to build back to where we were, which was a main contributing reason for the experiences that older people went through the past year during the pandemic? So we decided to change that into building forward better. And then someone else told us, in what world do you think that the next few years will actually involve building forward better for older people, particularly for those who live in low and middle income countries? So the title in itself is quite telling. Now, we've asked an economist to draft a background paper as we wanted these discussions on social policies to be anchored in economic realities. It's posted online on our website, and I invite you to check it out. During the meeting, there was an understanding that there are projected losses that governments will experience and that there will be a public financing fiscal crises, and we expect rounds of austerity. This means that there will be fewer resources, and we anticipate that it'll be harder to implement a human rights-based agenda. With less funding, less interest from member states as regards older persons, and less capacities, doubling down on a rights-based agenda will be key, and broadening and expanding stakeholder participation will be key as well. In parallel, as governments focus on more pro-growth agendas, it's important to make sure that older persons are represented in economic policies to produce that growth. Now, several issues on social health and data aspects were raised during the meeting. And, we found that during the pandemic, it amplified the arguments that we've already heard over the years. Issues related to ageism, to poverty, to access to healthcare. What was new, though, during the pandemic that was highlighted at the discussions during last week's meeting is that we need to rethink our approach to residential care. and also that society dictated the identity of older people, categorizing them during COVID-19. And we're seeing a counter reaction as many older persons are unwilling to accept to be boxed within that identification and see themselves as powerful, as resilient, as parts of society who had and continue to contribute to their societies and to the economies. And in these social health and data discussions, it is clear that substantive arguments do not win political battles. And it was highlighted that there is a need, an emphasis on sustainability and the need for a holistic perspective that links existing frameworks together and mainstreams aging into policies and into legislation. There was clearly a strong momentum for that in our discussions. And also highlighted is that action at the regional level is needed, and a focus on human rights and advocacy at the national level were also highlighted. Now, following the meeting, my best impression of it is a Twitter that I found one of our experts had sent out. She said that this week we participated in an expert group meeting on building forward better for older persons with lessons learned from COVID-19. The right time and very important topics. We move forward with a little more clarity and hope. I wish you the best deliberations during your meeting, and thank you for inviting us to share our experience last week with you.
So thank you, Yendesa. And I think that's really interesting and a nice segue to our next section, which is looking at what are the potential drivers and incentives which could help push this forward. And Punki, I want to start with you here because you're really the only one on the panel who is a part of government. I'm wondering if the sorts of things you've been hearing resonate with you in terms of will this encourage government to act, or are there other things which might be more useful?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yes, I think what you're going to do is actually make a good case study. And we need to involve the elderlies and the association or professionals and NGOs to design the right interventions to help the policies of the government in taking care of the elderly. In the case of Indonesia, we have put in our 5-year plan the issues of how we deal with the aging society in the future. I know our demographic bonus will end by 2040, but we have to start working from now. So this is actually why we have studies in 3 big cities on how the elderly respond during the pandemic issues. And now we are writing up the right policies and the strategies to deal with the issues here from the economics perspective, social support and health system. So by the time we have this, the drivers and the incentive for this, then we can make a good socialization strategy involving all stakeholders. So that's what actually we need to do. And this is actually what we have done in the past for whatever big national programs that we have so far.
Okay, so yeah, identifying some really strong case studies to inform a broader policy. There's a question in the chat panel directed to you that's asked about the role, and I'm not sure if I'll pronounce it right, of Bappenas.
Yeah.
Which the body that sort of spans ministries, because a lot of these issues are going to be cross-ministerial, aren't they? And there's always the risk that issues will slip between the gaps. What do you think the role of these sort of cross-government bodies is?
Actually, I'm from Bappenas, so that's actually what I'm doing. So what I do is that actually by, for example, making this kind of case studies, we involve lots of stakeholders. So we have to make sure that actually there is nothing left in the design of the project intervention itself. So we talk with the Ministry of Social Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health, for example, local governments, and elderly CSOs. So this is actually what we've been doing so far.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of where you sat in the scheme of things. Are there any other suggestions from panelists on the incentives which we might put in place, or conversely, are there barriers which might prevent things happening, which we actually need to break down? Sarah. Sarah first, and then Stephen.
I was just going to come in and say to hear someone like Punky from a key government talking about multi-sector approaches is fantastic, because I absolutely agree. All the evidence is this has to be tackled, not just from something around pensions or health, but looking at living environments, looking at education, looking at working opportunities. And so that I thought was really wonderful to hear you say that. The other thing I did wonder about is that obviously the pandemic has been about health, and particularly health across the life course. And we had that WHO report that's just come out about the relationship between obesity and deaths in COVID. And I think Vietnam was highlighted as one of the countries with almost the lowest obesity and one of the lowest sort of COVID death rates. And I wondered if the whole sort of health paradigm was a very good framing within which to start thinking about this, particularly taking this life course approach and helping people understand that aging is not just about extreme old age, but it's also something that we have to prepare for and build towards. And that would really engender, going back to your ageism question, John, that would really engender a feeling among younger generations about that we're on one life trajectory. It will be very different from all of us, and we will have different sort of framings of our own lives, but actually things like well-being and health and education are going to be very, very important for all of us across our lives.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Sarah, because I think one of the real opportunities is to link this in with other initiatives, including the Decade of Healthy Aging. And that was endorsed by the United Nations in December. It will run for the last 10 years of the Sustainable Development Goals period. And what it does is try to build, it's healthy aging, and people often think, health, we're talking about hospitals. No, not at all. Health here is defined by the ability of people to be and to do the things that they value. It's a capabilities model. And so it's taking a functional perspective. I think it provides a really neat framework around which we can orient some of the initiatives. So we have this shared goal of trying to build the functional ability of people of all ages to be and to do the things that they value, and looking at the individual and then the environment. And I'd like to come on to the environment in a second as well. But Stephen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I already mentioned, I think one incentive, I'll just talk about it a bit more, is that, investing in universal old age pensions is going to be great for the economic recovery after the pandemic, not just in terms of the additional spending in creating demand, which will create markets for entrepreneurs, but also I think in the longer term, by building the nation's human capital, enabling families to invest much more in their children, because they'll no longer be having to spend all their cash to care for their older generations, while also allowing grandparents to invest in their children. So in the long term, you've got the short term and longer term components of economic growth. But I think the second element is also the popularity of some of these schemes. Universal old age pensions and other universal social security programs have helped governments win elections across the world. If you want to win an election, this is a great way to do it. I could give lots of examples of how this has happened. That should be an incentive for policymakers, because they're very popular programs with your citizens. But not only that, it will help strengthen the social contract within countries by putting in place a universal service. It'll make people more willing to pay tax. So instead of austerity in the longer term, we can see a growth in tax income by strengthening the social contract, by investing in universal public services. So we don't have to have austerity. We can see this as an opportunity for a massive increase in tax income. And to be frank, in many Asian countries, the current levels of government revenues are tiny, and something needs to be done to change the social contract to increase that, because without an increase, we can't build back better for anybody if governments don't have the resources to be able to invest.
And that would be entirely consistent with what's been happening in the United States, where they're actually giving cash for children because they already have in place a social security system for older people. And also, interestingly, I think in the Asia Pacific, because countries' populations are still relatively young, now is the time to put in place these systems, because they're actually not going to cost a lot, because there's not a very big population of older people, and then they will gradually grow as the population changes. And it's much better time to put them in now than to try and put one in place in 20 years' time, when a much bigger proportion of the population is there, and it's a really big major step. Anyway, Marianne, you've been remarkably quiet. I'm wondering if you can identify some incentives that might help move things along.
Again, from a ground-up perspective, I think a political votes definitely counts, and I think the population of old people or the children grow older, come up to be voters, definitely is an issue, because people obviously are worried about how they're going to pay for older people, worry about how they're going to live, and the children worry about how they're going to pay for older people. So I think the vote in Singapore, with the ruling party, I think generally speaking, a vote is one of them for the government to think about. Of course, genuinely they want to take care of citizens. I like to think that. The other thing actually is interesting to read the story that the Ponki was saying is about stories. Recently, suddenly there's a parliament that's huge focus on caregivers. And of course, most of working with older people know there's always been an issue with caregivers, but during the COVID period, it's equal opportunity. Everybody got locked up. The MPs got locked up too. Everybody experienced it. And on top of it, the caregivers were under so much strain. There are quoted MPs saying, I'm having so much difficulty providing care. So when there's a spotlight on issue in the government, something will happen. So that's a good thing. It's actually during that period of time, I think where lockdowns, everyone gets locked down. Everyone has experienced the isolation, and everyone experienced when they don't get access to care, including people with decision makers. But having the case studies is very convincing, and having families speak out and having the older people themselves speak out actually is very important.
Okay, thanks, Marianne. Aiko, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. So let me pick up from what you talk about, the importance of sort of a broader health improvement as an important agenda for the future, but also about the incentive. So I would say that the incentive is to gain a silver dividend. So we learned that the older person's education levels, the health levels, or longevity has extended, and that economists are not just counting the cost, but also the benefit, in a sense that what does this better human capital of older person, if the economy is able to gain from that, can gain. And interesting observation is that for some country, yes, they are great untapped silver dividend, meaning that the older person who are more interested to continue work, who has good health and willing to contribute, but not working because of X and X. So for other countries, though, especially in developing Asia, you do see that extension of longevity come more from under 5 mortality even drop, but not necessarily very healthy older person. So when you look at things like labor force survey, you see actually increase in people giving sickness as reason for not being able to work. That's pretty, something that the government could act much more quickly and be able to, sort of cost and return. They are good return that the worker, the older person would get, and the country would get. So this really investing on the human capital of older person, including health as the most important reason, I think it's a very, very good incentive. And we would be doing more study to capture those potential size of silver dividend. And it's going to be large for some country, not so large for the country that have been not contributing quite extensively on the health services. That's what we expect.
Okay, so the contributions to health services that people made are reaped in a silver dividend subsequently. All right, we seem to be agreeing on everything. I promised people some dissent. Is there anything people disagree on what we're saying? Ponki, was that a hand raise? Or?
No, I'm itchy on my ear. No.
Okay, well, I'm going to move to our last questions, which is again trying to be very concrete and thinking about a practical thing, a practical action that can be put in place to make things start to happen. And I'm going to go from the reverse order I started with, and I'm going to start with Marianne. Do you have I'm just warning you, do you have a practical thing, an action that we can start to move on now, which are likely to make all of these things more possible?
Well, as I mentioned, I think it's really about older people giving voice themselves. Older people in Singapore previously did not have much of a voice. They were rather disempowered, and they did not speak out for themselves. Recently, it's interesting because during the lockdown, the people broke the rules and walked around were older people. They were just saying, I'm alone, I'm stuck in my house. These are older people who are not connected online. They're just, I'm old, I want to live my life. I'm not gonna live the rest of my life and die my flat by myself. So it seemed funny, but it wasn't very funny. And then people heard that these people, older people, were very, very isolated, and their life is just not gonna be meaningful if we can just lock them up like that. And the same thing with caregivers. During the time of COVID, everyone got locked up, right? So particularly the people who are older, spouses taking care of older people who are frail or have dementia, was very difficult for them. And those who have children cannot reach them because they're not allowed to visit. So those, again, so both older people themselves, the people who are the older caregivers themselves, as well as caregivers in general, start to speak up a lot stronger about their needs and issues. And like I said, during the time, I think the mental health impact in Singapore is not any different than anywhere else. Everybody had those impacts. So I think, for instance, it was so loud that the government really heard it. So I think from my point of view, older people themselves speaking up was quite powerful. As a matter of fact, there was one webinar I was in with some other policymakers. One older lady was saying, I lived my whole life. I don't live to die like this. And she was very poignant the way she talked about it. So I think when you have these stories and voices of older people speaking out themselves, I think when the policymakers hear it, it starts to become more real. Otherwise, it's just not real. So
Are there
me,
concrete things we can do that would enable the voice of older people to be heard more? Is there a gap or something we can put in place to make it happen?
Are you asking me or?
Yeah.
You're asking me. Yeah, I think there's something that probably folks like ourselves who work with a community can encourage. I think that's useful. As a matter of fact, generally speaking, I think increasingly that policymakers do have focus group working with older people. But it's one of those things whereby older people can voice out from the community. When they come together also helps, and that trying to help them to have more constructive kind of a dialogue. One of the programs we run is actually really about helping older people to be that contributor in the community. It's about empowering them to be like doing things by the older people, for older people, and for the community. And they come together as a group. They do get a little bit of training support. They work with design thinking people, with the community, with the policymakers, start to say, what is this going on in the community? What are the things that can make it better? And what can we do? What can older people do to improve? So helping giving them a little bit of organization support actually is very useful. And there's a constructive
the whole idea of co-invention, co-design is really important, and trying to think about how we can facilitate that. I better keep moving to keep the time. We're keeping wonderful time here. Aiko, have you got a suggestion for something which might help to bring about this transformation?
Sure. I think the government, especially our member country, developing Asian country, we have seen that they are really, revisiting and reformatting, or sometimes sort of rationalizing and bringing technology to providing better care and also a social protection to older persons. So it's really time to have, as Marianne said, about the voice, but also setting the right benchmark so that if so and so will be done, I think the research community as well as the stakeholders would be having an important voice in setting which benchmark to do. Target of X% of older person, then it has to be announced and has to be monitored closely. Then again, the data comes into very important role, because we want what was before and what is after. And this would take not just 1-2 years, it might take 5 years. So we really have to be vigilant in terms of what does the government plan has been, which is consolidating everyone's ideas and the good practices, to about 5 years horizon. What could be really done? So longer duration, but we cannot just be overexcited for a few years. A bit longer.
I think that's great, and I think it relates also to what Marianne was saying, Aiko. One of the things I've been able to do since leaving WHO is work a lot with the private sector, and I work with a lot of technology companies. I find in general have no idea. They think, oh, we've got to move into this space of aging because there's a big economic opportunity, and then they design something for a stereotype they have in their head of what an older person is. And I think this idea of co-design, of working with older people, so bringing the technology developers together with older people to design the product, could also be important. I'm wondering if that's something ADB could require in some of its funding, in its contracts, that it could say, listen, we're funding this, but we want it to be co-designed, not just top-down.
Yeah, I would not be able to speak on behalf of what ADB can do at this moment, but we do find a good practice for government funding a joint venture with the technology firm, which tend to be young, and mix it with older persons and trial and error. You cannot just have a generic one, which then would be catered for certain generations. So this kind of a model of funding specific project for specific purpose has worked and should be promoted. I think we see that in some of the initiative like Aging 2.0 and others who has been trying to promote this kind of platform. So that definitely is a good model to propagate. Yeah.
Ronki, over to you.
Yes, since I cannot agree more with Aiko, since we've started the studies on the elderly responding to the pandemic. I think what we are going to do is actually continue with the study and then look at the elements that I have explained earlier. And then by the time we have the results, findings, things like that, what we need to do, at least from the government, is to make a good case to the cabinet level and then advocate what the cabinet decision to the parliaments, because actually, usually that works like that in my case. So a good project proposal with a good result, well-designed monitoring evaluation system that speaks with it, by itself about the results, and then promote it to the cabinet level. Then usually we have the president and the parliament's approval. Then the money, the budget flows.
Excellent. Stephen.
Yeah, well, practical action. I think one practical action might be for governments to actually sit down and look at the evidence and not buy into the myths. You know, the evidence that, you know, put in place universal public services, in particular universal pensions, is affordable for all countries in Asia, and you know, and could be implemented within the next year if every country wanted to do it. Let's look realistically at, you know, a country like Nepal is spending 1.3% of GDP on its basic social pension for everybody over 70, as well as lots of women younger than that. If Nepal can do it, so can every other country in Asia. If Kenya can do it, which they've done recently, so can every other country in Asia. If Lesotho can do it, so can every other country in Asia. So look at the evidence. And I think there was one comment, I think, sort of saying, well, you know, there's a pushback in France. You know, why are we proposing this, you know, for Asia? Let's be realistic. In France, they spend 12% of GDP on their pensions. That's a realistic debate. Are you spending too much, right? That's a genuine debate that you could have. But we're talking about in Asia, where 1% of GDP would give you a really good pension system, 2% of GDP, an incredibly good pension system. It's all perfect. It's all very fiscally feasible to do. But look at the evidence and don't buy into the myths. Okay, that's the practical action. Then we might see something really changing.
Okay, Sarah, do you have a suggestion?
I do, and in fact, it goes back exactly to what Marianne was talking about, and co-design, and I think one thing that brings all this together, it comes back to this idea of intergenerational communities, and really practically working with policymakers and planners to help them understand the importance of people continuing to live together, and it sort of links up back to that conversation that Stephen and I started to have about the fact that. You know, all the evidence, particularly from Europe, is that when you bring some kind of welfare state in, older adults still are very, very much connected with their children and their grandchildren, but younger people tend to move away. And what we need to do is create these communities where younger people are still very much involved with all generations. So they're involved with older generations. And that will only work if we have the sort of physical environment that supports us living and working together. So I think integrated communities from an age point of view, that are also co-designed by the people who will be living in those communities.
Excellent. So we're actually starting to move into some of the questions that the audience has raised. There's one of the ones that was raised earlier was about the environment, and to me this touches on the things like the global network of age-friendly cities, and there's actually a lot of action taking place in some Asian cities. I look to Hong Kong, for example, where they're really looking to assess how the urban environment supports older people in what they do. I'm wondering if people think that there's an opportunity for expanding that across the Asia Pacific. And it may not just be the physical environment, it could also be the social environment, which we've been touching on a lot in our conversations. No takers? What about there's another question on data collection. What we touched on this earlier, Aiko, and maybe Punki, you've got something to say here. How do we? What are the gaps that decision makers need that's actually we can fill that will guide them towards building back better?
Yeah, I think the gap that I see is that actually it is not easy to formulate the real concept that we can ask the elderly on what they need. Usually what they give us the answer is basic answers. For example, yes, I need more funding support. I need more cash transfers, things like that. But is that really what they want? Is actually what we need to dig in more and more, because somehow actually this support system that actually we can provide through our social security program, for example, is something that actually needed. Yeah, so it is not only cash transfers that we can provide them. That's one thing. The second thing is that the kind of services that they need to have. This is actually quite new to us in Indonesia. So more data, more case studies that we need to do that will help us, the government, really understand what they need. So that's why I think it is very important to work with the professional organizations, the associations of the elderly groups that actually give us an example. For example, the geriatric services that 15 years ago, we didn't hear anything about that. Now it is already available in major cities in Indonesia because we learned from them. We heard them, what they need. But somehow to make them publicly understood by the local decision makers, that's actually another story. This is the gaps. These are the gaps that I always see from time to time.
I think they're great points, and they remind me of the anecdote about Henry Ford when he was inventing the sort of mass-produced motor vehicle, and he said, you know, if I'd asked them what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I think what we need to do is bring together the people who have really innovative new ideas so that we don't just ask older people what they want and then try and deliver it. We try and expose them to these new ideas and how the world could be different. And then we have to take that on board and think about, well, how can we help invent that? And that's really challenging. Well, look, we've kept a fantastic time, and I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I'd like to thank all the panelists, and I know Eduardo would like to we'll do that in a second too. But I'd also actually like to take just a moment to thank Eduardo and his team, because, you know, in my 10 years at WHO and since, Help Age Asia Pacific has really been one of the strongest movers towards the sort of things we're talking about in the world, and they've been a great partner, and I don't think we actually acknowledge your work well enough. So well done, guys. Thanks for helping us put this together. Thank you, panel, and we'll see you all later. Eduardo, over to you. Now, Eduardo, you've got to take off mute to fill your bit, or I'm going to have to close the session.
Unmute. Here I am. I was taken by surprise by your comment, and thank you so much, John. I think it has been a brilliant discussion. We could go on for hours talking about how do we envision and how do we make the better world happen. So thank you for moderating this session. We will follow up with a paper coming out of this discussion by Stuart, who made the initial presentation, building on what we have learned today, and will be shared with everyone who has registered for this event. I would like to thank everyone from the Pacific Islands to the American continent who have joined or will join this event. This is the last of a webinar series, and we thank the Asia Development Bank for their support in organizing this series. Before you hang up, we are finishing a couple of minutes earlier so that you have time to complete the assessment that of this session that will pop up in your screens as soon as I finish talking. The evaluation survey will be coming at the end. Please help fill in the form, and we welcome your suggestions for improving this type of events. Thank you so much. Thank you, John, in particular. Thank you all our panelists, our participants. I think each of them were brilliant. And have a good day. Good evening, good night, good morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.